All right, I'm here with Blake Allen Murphy from the Redbird Reboot podcast, here to wash out the taste of another weird game against the Seahawks, to prep for next week's game against the Vikings. How you doing, man?
Hey, doing well. A little bit better than some Cardinals fans today. You'd think that the sky is falling after they go to 6-5 in a season where some people were picking them to get 6 wins total. I think it's just something that's very fun. When you look at the NFC West, you've got 2 teams at 6-5, 2 teams at 5-6, and it's just right now probably the most competitive division in the sport from top to bottom, with the Chicago Bears kind of being the letdown in the NFC North right now.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, it's good to be able to be here talking about another Cards game, since we've got a strange history going back and forth with Cardinals Vikings games, obviously.
Yeah, talk about weird games. Jesus.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I don't love that history, so glad you brought it up. But history's mostly just been, I think, sad from a Vikings perspective, although they did get the Xavier Rhodes interception return, which is nice.
I was going to say, the Cardinals have not beaten the Vikings in Minnesota since like the 70s. So it's been one of those weird areas where like Cardinals fans would go to Minnesota and it's like, all right, this is great. Like we never win over here. Whereas Vikings come to Arizona, it's like, let's see how we're going to blow this game within the last 5 minutes, just in a random or spectacular way.
It's beautiful. Yeah, no, I feel like the Cardinals are not going to have, or haven't had, a normal game in a bit, or not going to have a normal game in a bit. This will probably add to that. But I did want to try and figure out, all these questions obviously throughout the Cardinals roster, but mostly I was like, hey, everyone was making fun of the new head coach when that intro video came out. How's it gone since then? How do we feel about the head coach? How do we feel about Jonathan Gannon?
Yeah, I mean, so far what it does feel like is that this team has come into the year with having pretty low expectations, and they have been able to be consistently performing above most of those expectations, especially on the defensive side. And a lot of it has to do with taking guys who were essentially just depth caliber players, not really a lot of stars, and being able to kind of get a lot more out of the defense from the sum of its parts than in individual players. You've also seen a revitalized offense with Kyler Murray back throwing the ball. It's a little bit of an upgrade from the likes of Josh Dobbs, Clayton Tune, and one-armed Colt McCoy from last year, I believe, which was unique coming into watching camp. You're like, yeah, this is great. And this man, Brock Purdy, of the same shoulder, it seems like, from whatever reports are going on. But yeah, the biggest thing that's really been changing in terms of how Arizona has functioned is that they've never really been able to bring in a head coach who you felt like is not just comparable, but someone who at least you can kind of build with for a while. They've had some late runs with some coaches, at least. The Bruce Arians era obviously comes to mind. Whereas with Gannon, there's areas everywhere from the special teams to the offense to the defensive side where you see little details that pop up. Like a couple weeks ago, there was an onside kick, and every single member of the special teams unit waved their hand for a fair catch because they didn't know where the ball was going to go. Incredible. They just knew that they could do it. And you're like, this is one of those little like Mike Vrabel-esque like cheating the system type of things that's there. And it just shows you that the team has come such a long way, and player buy-in is pretty heavily in favor of, these guys that they've had with a lot of youth on the staff. I think that their coach they have on the defensive side, Nick Rallis, is about 31. I think he just turned, and I'm like, all right, this guy's younger than me, and like he's doing crazy things out there with 7th round defensive tackle as the most amount of sacks on the team this year. It's like, all right, this is something that shows in a lot of ways that what Arizona really kind of needed was a full on culture change. Really had not come since probably the 2013 season with the former general manager. Now with a new general manager, hiring a head coach, moving on from a lot of people who were there previously, and the ownership at least letting them kind of do their thing versus, some of the meddling or different things that it would come up, obviously, with every owner, but specifically in Arizona had a reputation. It's kind of had their turnaround. Instead of being this 2-year worth of rebuilding, they've kind of turned it around and are pushing for a playoff spot. And really just the first year they've had Kyler Murray healthy from the start of the season.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about Kyler Murray. Obviously, they extended a contract on him a little bit ago. He's supposed to be, pretty high level quarterback, but he's not entered into conversations for anything like an MVP, conversations for top 5 quarterback. But, everyone kind of expects him to be consistently productive. A lot of that comes from the fantasy community where they get to take advantage of his rushing yards. But I just feel like the expectations of his production and his evaluation by, like people who like rank quarterbacks, right? Whatever that group is, are kind of out of sync here, where they expect more production than one would expect from somebody not considered a consistently elite quarterback. Do you have any insight as to why that might be?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to the reputation that he's had in two regards. One was coming out of college, in which he just was not a taller quarterback for the most part and didn't have that instant sort of playoff success that someone like a Russell Wilson or even a Drew Brees did. And then, of course, the other factor I think would be just the narrative that shifted when he did have that contract extension that came up, because Arizona did not win a lot of games down the stretch in 2021. They were pretty much a top-heavy team that then was missing DeAndre Hopkins and J.J. Watt and didn't really have a lot of depth to be able to close the season out strong. So they got blasted in the playoff game against Aaron Donald and the Rams that year, who I believe ended up going on pretty well, at least as far as for being able to go in the playoffs. I think it was ultimately Tom Brady.
Did okay.
Yeah, they did pretty well for themselves. So. But it's something where the reputation has always been there. And I think part of it has to also do with there's a stigma that some quarterbacks, I think, are able to develop when it comes down to putting a lot of blame on the quarterback himself versus a lot of the areas that surround said quarterback. Good examples of this is you look at narratives, at least around guys like where it's Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray, as far as where they're guys who are able to put up probably a couple hundred, or in Lamar's case, like almost 1,000 rushing yards per season. A guy like Tua, who we've seen the Dolphins with him and the Dolphins without him. And a lot of people are like, oh, he's a Tyreek, Jalen Waddle merchant. And then, you get the Skylar Thompson experience for a little while. I think that a lot of what people have with Kyler Murray is that there was areas, everything from body language to the regression that Arizona showed from 2021 to the 2022 season. And really, it felt like the Kyler's personality is someone who wants to be pushed, who wanted to be coached, who wanted to actually have forms of accountability like he was getting back when he was in Oklahoma with all this talent and pushing for national championships. And when he came to the Arizona Cardinals, who are historically a losing franchise, and was going to, coach in Cliff Kingsbury, who, if we're going to be frank and honest, he was like, I'm just happy to be here and that we can have Kyler around. Like, he would have a hard time, pushing him or being critical, because it was just a guy who'd gotten fired from Texas Tech. And now we've been able to see as that narrative has stretched out, there seems to be some benefits and then as well as some flaws that Kingsbury just has not been able to adjust. And I think that and the Steve Keim syndrome pretty heavily weighed down on him. There's a lot of things that you can talk about with Arizona, but it's one of those places where they really have to kind of hit rock bottom in order for that culture to be reset. And as a result, Kyler's been revitalized this year. He's had a pretty solid overall when you're talking about like some of the not just quarterback ratings with QBR. He's in the top, I believe it's still top 5, number 4 right now for each of those. His EPA has been somewhere in the top 10 relative throughout this season. He's, I think, finishing with the EPA CPOE composite is what I like to look for, because that usually is best way to determine who's going to be the MVP at the end of the season.
Right.
For the most part, he's been playing fine there. It just has been interesting because a lot of the fantasy community, I think, have also been looking at Kyler going, he's not running for as much yards as he did. Like, where are my Marvin Harrison Jr. passing yards? It's just been something where the Cardinals have been very unique in how this offense has been run this year. And there's been some questions of consistency. At the end of the day, though, it does really, I think, showed that this was kind of the season that people had hoped that Murray was going to be able to have, to kind of prove that, yeah, not only is it worth that you can get a quarterback that you can have that consistency with, but that you're at least going to be competitive in pretty much every game. And in this game, the Cardinals, I think against the Minnesota Vikings, they're probably going to be competitive in that game because of the play of their quarterback as much as any other defensive or offensive player is. And that's something that, there's some teams right now that would kill to have a quarterback like that because they're just in quite a bit of limbo. And that's something that Arizona was kind of able to get out of. And this year has kind of confirmed that they probably made a decent move in being able to extend him, although it may be that he never lives up to the top 5 expectations. If you have a top 10 quarterback in the league, you're going to be out there winning games most of the time on Sundays, and you'll probably be having at least a better week-to-week experience than the likes of, say, how the New York Giants have been in the past 10 years or so.
Well, so we're talking about kind of these aggregate level performances, statistics, expectations. What is it that he does well? What is it that's keeping him out of the top 5? I mean, obviously everyone focuses on his size, his speed, the fact that his arm strength seems to be significantly larger than his size would suggest. But what is it in terms of, his skill set that allows him to be consistently productive, but not put him into those top 5 conversations with like a Mahomes and Allen, a Jackson, and so on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that it comes down to is that there's enough kind of drawbacks that you can get with some height areas. Like I know first couple seasons there was issues over the middle. Some of that's actually been resolved with getting a nice pass catching tight end, which as we've seen, there's been also a case of when you've got the legs of someone like a Kyler Murray who, like most of us are going to drive like, a Honda or an Audi around, where he's going to have like, a Mitsubishi. Kind of works the same for as far as his legs too. He's able to get out of pressures and get away from players that a lot of NFL quarterbacks really aren't able to. And so then as a result, you can kind of sometimes be able to get into negative areas where sometimes you can like, all right, I can beat this guy or I can outrun him. Other times, what I think the biggest area currently that we've seen with him is that there's time that it takes for some plays to develop, and there's hits that he just doesn't take as a quarterback because he's able to either scramble or get away, extend the play, pick up a couple of yards. And as far as when it comes to his arm talent, he really has probably I'd say like top 7 or so arm as far as the deep passing game. What he really hasn't shown this year has been kind of that consistency with the deep ball. There's been enough overthrows. And I think the biggest thing when you're talking about what's kind of keeping him from that next step is probably just being able to have a little bit more of the, I would say at least he's improved tremendously from the pocket this year, but when things are breaking down and he gets pressure in his face up from the middle, the defensive tackles from the interior, you look at games previous to this season with the Rams getting edge pressure. He dealt with that fine, was able to kind of scramble or get away. You look at the Rams when they had Aaron Donald, and that really was when it made a huge difference. And in the Seattle Seahawks game just last week, Leonard Williams really limited the Cardinals offense in a lot of ways because they just were not able to have that consistent pocket on the interior. So I think that other guys, when you see like a Josh Allen or even a Mahomes, they've got a ability, whether it's with the height or with some of the ways that they can creatively solve some of those interior pass rushing problems, that Murray, from what we've seen, he can be able to use a good set of toolboxes, but it doesn't seem like he's quite in that toolbox to be in the top 5 of quarterbacks consistently. And I think that's one of the things, if you're going to attack him this week, as far as Brian Flores is concerned, that's where I'd probably start, is taking a look, knowing that that's probably going to be the best way to be able to get pressure, affect some of the different throws, and potentially even see if you can force a turnover.
So this differential between, edge pressure, interior pressure, that's all like, for a Vikings fan, kind of academically interesting. They don't really have the ability to generate interior pressure, but they also don't rush with 4 all that often. They
Right.
blitz more than any other team in the league by a pretty substantial margin. Based off of what I can see, and I haven't run the numbers, but it seems as if for the 2024 season, of people with the number of qualifying snaps, et cetera, so on, it seems like there's the largest difference between PFF grade when not blitzed versus PFF grade when blitzed. So he has a PFF grade of 86.3 when not blitzed, a PFF grade of 65.9 when blitzed. And I'm not seeing anybody with a grade of 85 or higher below him in terms of people who are performing poorly when blitzed. So he's probably number 1, number 2, number 3 in that differential. Obviously, all of the caveats about PFF grades apply, but is there something kind of concrete there? Because if there is, other teams aren't taking advantage of it. He's getting blitzed at about a league average rate. His yards per attempt when blitzed is about, looks like just slightly under league average. It's not anything special. So PFF might be finding something. His turnover worthy play rate's pretty high, but his interception total isn't, that kind of stuff. Is there something particular about the blitz that he's weak to? Is it just kind of variance because there's like a relatively low sample size we're working with? How has he performed in previous years against the blitz? Is it different when the blitz is coming up the middle versus like a free safety on the outside? What is it about his response to the blitz that has kind of produced this pattern?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it ends up being the way that he's able to solve problems comes down to when you're looking at how the offensive line and how protections are able to be formatted. He does his best work for the most part when he's able to get rid of the ball quick, has a good decision, able to make an accurate throw. Earlier this season, he actually, I believe, has one of the, I'll have to see what the PFF numbers back it up, but he had one of the higher grades where you're like, hey, Kyler, at least when he's blitzed, has pretty low as far as for his ability to get rid of the ball. But when he's pressured, he had I think at one point he was like first in the NFL and he was playing better under pressure than from a clean pocket. So it seems like in that regard that the ability just for him to be able to get with his legs, to move, to be able to readjust or be able to make these quick snap decisions in this offense, those are areas that it seems like he is able to thrive in, where we've seen the last, I would say at least maybe game or two. I think back to the New York Jets where they had a corner blitz that kind of came from the backside that wasn't picked up. Just didn't seem like he had the pressure sensed as well. I think that what teams are really kind of finding is that if you can use the blitz to take away some of his legs, then you're able to kind of take one of those creative tools out of his box for the most part. And if the blitz is done in a way where it's kind of a post-snap coverage, having to be able to read and make a quick throw versus, oh, I got like 2 or 3 seconds for this play to develop. Meanwhile, there's someone streaking off of the edge. That was something that we saw in this past Seattle game where the Seahawks were mostly getting interior pressure, but there was a time or two that their tackles struggled in this game. And that really ended up being kind of a difference maker where Kyler took a sack or two on some plays that had started in Seattle territory, I believe, or they'd gotten into Seattle territory and those sacks pushed them out of it. I think that it's going to be interesting to see how the game script works this week because a lot of what the Cardinals had done over the past few weeks would have been getting the ball out to James Conner and Trey McBride quickly and letting those two get the yards after catch breaking tackles. James Conner has, I believe, the most broken tackles in the NFL this season overall as far as for players are considered. I think he's just ahead of I want to say that there's even like a Najee Harris who a lot of volume on some of those stats right as well. That's something that is part of the way that they can get out of some of those kind of tough situations, live to be able to fight another down, and then being able to use his legs to escape as well. There's been some creative playmaking that he's been able to utilize where if teams are able to get up a little bit more in the pocket, he can kind of bail out the back door, extend the play running to the side, and he's able to see McBride or Marvin Harrison Jr. uncover a bit, be able to make a play downfield. If you blitz him at least where you're able to kind of blitz into some of Arizona's play tendencies, knowing, hey, Kyler likes to roll right for a little bit, or if he's going to bail, he'll like to kind of flip his hips around, kind of run out the back door to the left. If you know that those are going to be some of the different places and you can kind of keep enough of a rush in front of him, those are two ways I think that you'd be able to defend him. The hard part, of course, is that you're going to then need that 6'6", 300-pound man to have to go and tackle a 5'10", 200-pound little kid who's running out there with, like someone's coming after his Pop-Tart or something. It's a lot harder than you would think to be able to pull it off, at least in the NFL level, because he's such an incredible athlete. One of the games this season we got to see against the Chargers, he was I think it was they brought 4 guys, at least in the pass rush. There was no one there. They had a guy who was back there as a spy. Murray kind of runs out when someone runs up to pressure him, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, there's literally no one here. Everyone's just covering downfield, and the junior Colson took a bad angle. So he just outruns Colson on the angle and then struts out like 50-plus yards all the way to the end zone for a long touchdown. Those are the types of plays, at least, that ultimately when you're playing man coverage, or even if you're going to be playing a super deep zone and just dropping less guys there, it's kind of one of those places where if you get home, you're going to do well. If you're not able to get home, that's part of where Arizona, unlike last year, has a couple of guys who are able to break tackles or be able to pick up some first downs or get down the field.
Yeah, so I'm looking at. So let's talk about running backs for a little bit because you mentioned Connor in response to the blitz. So I looked at his PFF stats. Obviously, again, these all change from organization to organization, but Connor is currently ranked third in total rushing missed tackles forced and second in total receiving missed tackles forced, which I, again, haven't looked at every running back, but there's no one above him in receiving that is also above him in rushing. So this suggests that there's a really strong possibility that he has the highest number of total missed tackles forced in both rushing and receiving. I'm also looking at his receiving numbers, and it's telling me he's got 1.60 yards per route run, which is eighth in the NFL. But of those guys, he has the second, I guess lowest is the best way to put it, depth of target, which suggests he's not running routes like Christian McCaffrey is, who's got a depth of target of 4. No other running back near the top has anything close to a positive number. His is negative 1.8. The only one behind him is Bucky Irving, negative 2.5, which also to me suggests swing passes, blitz outlets, stuff like that. And yet he's still able to get 1.6 yards per route run. He's up there in total receiving yards among running backs, like, eighth or so. What is it about his usage pattern in Arizona that makes him valuable? Is this something that, is just, it's a product of his ability to, because he's like, he's a height weight guy, not as much of a speed guy based off of his college profile, at least. Is it his ability to just break tackles, or does he do something in addition to that makes him like ineffective runner and receiver?
No, what you're talking about, I think, with him is that his contact balance is extremely good, because a lot of times where Kyler will have they'll do a play that's there, he'll hit the check down for the most part to Connor, who's only like you said, about a yard or two downfield, and you got one guy in space for him to be able to beat. Sometimes they'll actually draw up plays where you can tell that it's specifically going to be trying to get a linebacker on James Conner, because Connor's able to make him miss, or with that large body, because his balance is so good, he'll be able to kind of shed the would-be tackler event and then pick up another 4 to 5 yards. There's been time after time this year, we've been able to see Connor be able to take one of those passes, and then when he gets first contact, he doesn't go down and is able to keep going. We have seen, for the most part, that he's not quite gotten to that spot where it seems like he's falling off as far as a back is concerned. But last year he was at about 5 yards or so per carry. Cardinals were running the ball, at least by the end of the year, pretty effectively. This year, he's on track to hit that 1,000 yards rushing, which he had only hit for the first time last year, but he's down to about 4.2 yards or so per carry. And I think that some of that is a combination of just the usage that he has on the inside is not getting quite as much push. Some of that may just be with how the league has adjusted some to this Cardinals offense and some of the way that they just love having all sorts of counter plays. And then the other is, you can probably say that there's a reason why they went out and took a Trey Benson in the 3rd round of the NFL draft, is just recognizing when you get kind of close to that 30-year-old window, that cliff could pop off anytime for the most part. There's only a handful of running backs who are able to keep their careers going to kind of hit those 1,000-yard metrics, or being able to still be elite players in the game. I think that his mentality is quite there, where he could be one of those guys, but like you said, the way that Arizona is structured, they want to be a run-first team. They want to be able to make sure that they're having a diverse and more balanced offense. And what we saw earlier in the season was, if teams were kind of selling out to stop with James Conner, the Cardinals really had to retool a bit of their passing attack, because when the run was getting stopped, you're having Kyler being back in 2nd and 11. All of a sudden, you could get off script quite easily for the most part. That's something where we've seen some of these games that Arizona's been able to have, where they just had pretty poor offensive performances. But on the other side, when they are being able to have that balance for them, you've seen some huge game outputs, like the couple weeks before, at least, where they ran all over the Chicago Bears, in which he set a franchise record for completions against the Jets. And then even earlier in the season against the Rams, where it just was an aerial attack, Arizona just kind of blew the Rams out in the first quarter and didn't really look back from there.
So I'm taking a look at these fumble numbers. It seems like he's got a slight bit of a fumbling problem. But at the same time, I'm looking at his like career fumble numbers, and it certainly looks like it seems very much like he's fumbling at twice the rate this year per touch than he was for the rest of his career. So is this going to regress? Does he have a fumbling issue this year? It's not that many. It's like 3. But is this like an area of concern against a relatively opportunistic defense that has done a better job than most at producing turnovers?
I mean, one of those fumbles I remember specifically was against the Los Angeles Chargers where the ball got ripped away. I believe that it was actually James Conner on an interception Kyler Murray threw, actually punched the ball out later, and the Cardinals recovered a fumble. So I think it was one of the first times where the Cardinals had 3 takeaways for the most part. One of those was a pick that Murray threw to a defensive lineman. They punched it and got the ball back, actually advanced the ball. Another they got on a deep throw that would have been a touchdown for the most part, but just ended up getting stripped and taken away. And then the last one, of course, was the fumble that James Conner had that was also likewise recovered by the Cardinals. So it's like there's been a few more fumbles this year than most, but he averaged probably about 1.5 or so a year for his career as far as with just fumbles in general. He's not as bad as far as with fumbles being lost. I think it's one of those places where you're going to attack Arizona and Connor. The best way to get after it is to try to attack the offensive line. They've had a season-ending injury to Will Hernandez, who's kind of their longtime guy at the right guard spot. Froholt has been, or Schulte, I guess is the way you'd pronounce it, has been decent as far as like he's a good starting center. He has good run blocking, can get out there in space, but they struggled some last week with Jonah Williams coming back in for the first time. They'd previously had Kelvin Beachum at the right tackle spot, a 37-year-old who's technically been good, but then you watch Von Miller go up against me like, okay, like this, he's probably not a one-on-one against a top-notch edge rusher. I know the Vikings have a few of those. The end of the day with Connor, the biggest thing, at least to take away, is that if you're able to have him kind of be a volume touch guy where he gets about 20 or so carries, he's going to be able to kind of just wear you down. And that's something where if the Cardinals end up getting a lead, it's unfortunate for most teams because then they can kind of recommit to some of the running, keeping a balanced offense and be able to move the ball down the field while taking time off of the clock. There's been a couple of times this year where Arizona's put together, like 8 to 10 minute drives to be able to just take some of the opposing offenses out of the game from being able to come back without having to strike quickly. And that's one of the approaches that Jonathan Gannon did seem to want to make this year. He wanted Kyler Murray to kind of move out of that air raid, quick strike offense, get as many plays in as possible to making the most of their possessions, playing disciplined football, and then being able to actually manage the game and manage the clock. Arizona's been able to have the ball in the last, I should say, 2 minutes of the game multiple times this season because of the way that Gannon's managed the clock and put them in 3 of those opportunities. They had a chance to win the game, and they went out and were able to get a game-winning field goal or a score to be able to win a close one.
Cool. You mentioned the offensive line. I want to get to them in a second. I do want to touch really quickly on Trey Benson, Amari DeMarcado. Back when I was in a dynasty league, I was like really hoping DeMarcado would do something. Hasn't happened. Don't got to worry about it anymore. Not in that league anymore. But you've got a rookie third rounder. How have these running backs kind of emerged? How are they being used in the offense, if they're being used at all? What's your take?
Yeah, so what we've kind of seen has been a few more snaps over the last couple of weeks for Trey Benson. Like he had a first career touchdown. There was a couple of times that he was the main bell cow on some of those drives. There's still a James Conner-led team, but you can at least see is how they at least the Cardinals' old coaching staff would not really have good – it just was not synced up between what the front office would look for and desire and what the coaching staff was looking for or playing. And even when it came down to times where they could agree on players, there wasn't necessarily the correct vision, I would say, for how those guys are going to get up to speed and be able to play in the NFL. Whereas it came with the Cardinals and like the previous Steve Keim years, you kind of take a look at some of their draft picks, especially down the last few years, and you're like, all right, so you're going to go linebacker safety hybrid, then another linebacker, and now you're trading your first round pick for Kyler's BFF, and you're not going to extend him right away, so you're just kind of keeping him on that 2-year deal, so you're going to keep him. It's like, all right, well, at least you didn't have a need at center, and you sent away a quality first-round center to the team. Well, Tyler Linderbaum went to the Ravens. Oh, all right, it's kind of cool. They really were addressing immediate needs, and the Keim philosophy was was, hey, like you can go for it every year. And a lot of the way that the team kind of fell off at the end was because they were really pushing to kind of go for another year for that job security, to get that one last deal, which they did. The Cardinals are still paying Kyman Kingsbury until 2027. So it's been part of the reason why the Arizona Cardinals have a lot of cap space over the next year or two, is because they just are trying to make sure they can get their cash situation consistent moving forward. But with having a guy like Amari DiMercato, who came in, undrafted free agent, who has some burst, was able to probably be like probably not necessarily a speedster, but he was someone who was willing to go in, do the dirty work in blocking, being kind of that third down pass blocker. That's something that we've been able to really see him be kind of that main third down guy. If Connor's not on the field or needs to get in there for a spell, he's at least been decent. They haven't thrown the ball to him enough, I think, as they could. But he's a smaller back, so that willingness that you can have in pass protection, there's been times that it has worked out great for Arizona. There's been times that it just hasn't quite been there. And I think that that's one of the cases where, when you're talking about this is a team that's still being constructed, like going into next year, whether you extend Connor or not, you're going to be obviously looking at more of Trey Benson getting snaps. You're looking at DiMercato. He's a guy that probably is going to be getting backup snaps for Arizona, whereas you're probably looking at him as more of a running back 3, more of that kick returner guy. That's one of the cases where you're talking about how Arizona, the way that their team has been built, a lot of what they've kind of done has been together. The players knowing their roles, having a set plan for them, has been bigger than the sum of their parts. What we've seen so far from Benson looks like that he's at least shown enough as a runner. I think that his pass blocking, they've had him in limited snaps in pass blocking this season, but when they have had him in, he's had like the highest PFF pass blocking grade on the team as far as it goes for outside of, I will say, as far as for like number of snaps, especially too, with like, you know, a minimum number of snaps, he's not quite there yet. It's a spot where with Arizona, the other thing that you look at is you can't really talk about the running game without talking about Kyler Murray, because he is one of those players who they are going to limit the opportunities he's going to get as far as for purely running the football, even more than a Lamar Jackson. But when he does, it's like going to be in high leverage situations, such as on fourth down. On sometimes you'll have those as far as in the red zone for touchdowns, being able to have the ability to kind of sell the play action, force a bootleg, move the pocket a little bit. Each of those things to get your linebackers to have to respect the run and even respect Murray with his legs. That opens up some of the passing game downfield. And he's especially made music with Trey McBride this year, being able to connect with him on a lot of those play action passes. And it's difficult for defenders because you get this conflict in space, because McBride is a solid blocker as well. Like, he's not going to be this Travis Kelce. We're going to basically flex him in as an inline blocker. And, you know, if you actually just, we're going to expect him to block, you're not going to get that much. Him being able to have the ability to block and being consistent with that, and then being able to also get open on routes, it's really allowed the Cardinals to play a lot of 13 personnel this year, where they're able to put 3 tight ends on the field, and then they can use Trey McBride like a wide receiver. Or they could even just move into a rushing play where suddenly you've got a linebacker who's got some speed on the outside. You get a big 280-pound tight end on him, and suddenly it changes the equation with their running game, where they're able to pick up a bit more than they would have otherwise, just from having more guys that are there in the box. And you also have to respect them in the pass if you're a defender. That's been one of the areas we've seen where it's not necessarily created cheat codes, but it has been really the bread and butter of Arizona's offense, has been kind of spamming these 12 and 13 personnel plays to be able to open things up defensively. And that's something that we were able to at least see the Seahawks find ways to deal with in the rain yesterday. And I'm curious to find out how much of that will be with the Vikings getting guys on the line, getting pressure with 4 versus having to kind of play that chess match of sending blitzers out for the most part, and Arizona seeing if they can counter with getting more hats on bodies and being able to, you know, run the ball right into the teeth of that Flores defense.
Sure, and I definitely do want to talk about, especially like Tip Ryman, the rookie that blew up the combine. It was a ton of fun watching the combine workouts with him. Blocking tight end in college, I assume that's what he is in Arizona, especially based off what you described. But I did want to discuss the offensive line, so we didn't lose that thread super quick. You mentioned Jonah Williams right now replacing Kelvin Beachum because that was the intended starter before injury. You mentioned Hjalte Froholt, who's a 6'5" center.
Yeah.
Just kind of a strange situation, just generally speaking. But there's like other interesting, elements at play here, right? They have Evan Brown from Seattle. They've got Tristan Colon from the Jets. They have Isaiah Adams from the draft, but also Paris Johnson, who I don't recall playing outstandingly last year as a rookie, but I have to imagine they've been relying on him to be kind of their anchor at left tackle. So could you tell me a little bit more about kind of as a whole how that group has been doing at pass protection? I know you've gotten a little bit into kind of the run blocking, but I do want to know a little bit more about how this group, especially without Will Hernandez, has done in pass protection.
Yeah, no, with as far as pass protection goes, you're right in that Paris Johnson has been the anchor this year. Last year, he was having to play left tackle while DJ Humphries was kind of in his last year with the Cardinals. Ended up, of course, having that ACL tear with 2 games to go left in the season. He's now found his way onto the Chiefs roster. So, like, if you're a 2022 Cardinals fan who's looking at the Chiefs, who have got DeAndre Hopkins, Hollywood Brown, and DJ Humphries now, you're like, oh, this is interesting, at least to be able to see kind of a revitalization of some of Steve Keim's best work is going on, it seems like, over there in Kansas City. But Johnson, at least, has overall been stellar. He had, I believe, when it comes to how he's done in pass protection, his overall worst game of the season was up against the Niners, where he had to face the likes of Nick Bosa. And his second worst game of the season was, I believe, it was a toss-up between the Rams game with Jared Verse, at least, in the outside, and then the Seattle game on that side. But other than that, he's been stellar as far as being able to be their top pass protector as the season total goes. He's got the highest pass blocking grade on the team for, I believe it's like about plus 300 snaps or more. So that's one of the places where getting that established left tackle from the start was something that was an interesting move for Arizona, because they had a big choice to make last year. Do you stay at the 3rd overall pick, take a Will Anderson? Do you take multiple firsts from the Houston Texans, who are supposed to have a top 5 pick next year? Well, we saw that kind of turned into a playoff victory. So it shows that you never really know how the NFL will go when you make those trades. What really has been kind of interesting about this year than last year is Evan Brown has been a stabilizing force for the Cardinals, as far as left guard was a swinging gate for them last year. They just were never able to find a consistent starter for the most part. They had, I think it wasn't Laken Tomlinson, but they had another couple of players back. I think it was Elijah Wilkinson's the name now, I remember. Tristan Colon, who came in a time or two. They really just were having a huge weakness at left guard, but the offensive line last year was relatively strong overall. They just were not really able to have a quarterback who was able to make some of those plays down the field consistently to be able to win games early on in the season. And the defensive side of the ball, their cornerbacks were another thing, but we'll talk about those later. The biggest thing that we've seen for the most part has been that the Cardinals over the last couple of weeks, until the game they played on Sunday, they had not let up a sack over the previous 3 weeks, and they had been one of the better pass protecting lines this year. They've been really good as far as it's come with blitz protection, with pickup, and being able to be a run-first offense, being able to have a lot of play action from under center. It's kind of protected Kyler Murray as a result as well. I think that the league has blossomed into more of that, playing multiple safeties over the top to limit some of these wide receivers, opening up space for the run game, kind of we'll give up a 10-yard play to you, we don't want to give up a 35-yard touchdown to you sort of mentality that the Vic Fangio offense has been known for. And since you see Kyle Shanahan style offenses all over the league and how they've to some degree struggled a bit more than they have in years past around the league, I think that's been part of where Arizona's kind of leaned into some of that trend in being able to get some of those players in. What's been also interesting is we've seen them be able to utilize a guy like an Isaiah Adams a bit more often. Adams actually is one of their top 5 offensive linemen when it comes to run blocking, but he's one of their bottom 5 pass blockers on the team, which is fascinating when you talk about as a draft profile, because it's pretty much exactly what his draft profile looked like coming out of Illinois, with the only gap being he played a little bit of right tackle in his senior year due to injuries. No one else was able to be it, so he kind of was a good soldier to do so. They've had sometimes that they'll bring him into some certain situations and some drives, kind of getting experience. It does feel like that part of what Arizona had struggled with for a long time was not being able to land these middle round sorts of talents, like not being able to find a Trey Benson in the 3rd round for 4 years of control to just not having to pay a veteran to be your blocking tight end, not finding one of these mid-round offensive linemen versus, kind of having to sign and pay a Rodney Hudson, trying to sign and pay a Justin Pugh. You're kind of having to put a huge investment into the offensive line for the most part, and that lack of scouting ability and lack of just having some of those contracts, or in the Steve Keim fashion, trading those picks away for other veteran players, really led the team to needing to kind of get a reset in terms of how they were able to not just draft, but also develop different linemen. And it's a spot where, like, we've been able to see throughout the season, like you talk about the right guard in Will Hernandez goes down for the season, and Tristan Colon comes in for the most part. He actually has a similar pass blocking grade. And then as far as run blocking, he's actually just about 1 point high. I think it's like about 1/10 of a point higher than where they're at with Will Hernandez. And so there's adjustments that we can see the coaching staff has been able to make. There's also just being able to lean into actually having when you talk about everything from a top to bottom culture buy-in, there's a lot of platitudes that comes down to, it's people are going to think, all right, we took the ping pong tables out this time. That means the culture is finally back in the building. That's something that really, when it comes down to it, is it's about being able to have good coaches and good players. And that's a mesh that we've seen in Arizona that probably had not been there since the Bruce Arians era. Like, there was times where there was this whole philosophy of, like, all right, whoever goes out, the next player is going to be up. And you'd see guys like coming off of the street who's a former wide receiver who plays a couple corner snaps to get through a game. And it's like, all right, that's like a great, we can win now type of approach. This new Cardinals approach seems to be looking at not just in trying to win games on Sunday, but establishing to try to win games long term, as far as with not just, we could be leaving one of our rookies who's here on the sideline for the most part, instead of getting him a couple of snaps of experience a game, but they're bringing him into some of these situations, putting in some different scripts. They really then are allowing, in that regard, to actually have more continuation than just kind of like a huge flash, I would say, like a fuse that burns bright and then burns out quickly, which is something that the Cardinals would struggle with a lot of times, and it usually would turn into getting their coaches canned. And one of the things that really stands out about this Jonathan Gannon era so far is there's never been a Cardinals coach who's finished 6 years with the team from a head coaching perspective. Like, they've never gotten a contract extension, or if they had, you got to see that Ken Wisenhunt-led team in Arizona just kind of ended up bottoming out in 2012 in that 6th year, by the time that they had no quarterback, no offensive line, and a bunch of stars on defense who would constantly force turnovers from opposing teams. And then John Skelton goes 3 and out for the most part, like that, overthrowing the ball in the red zone. They kick a field goal despite getting the ball at the 6-yard line. This is a different type of Cardinals team. What's interesting is that a lot of where they're at being ahead of schedule, it probably means that this offensive line is going to continue to be a strength for the team, because they at least have a decent foundation, and they still have their draft picks next year. I'm assuming they're going to be spending a high draft pick somewhere in the first 2 days, I should say, on an interior offensive lineman to kind of cover up that gap for whether it's left guard or right guard, just getting a younger body in there. And it's something that I think we'll be able to see them have in the future moving forward. That is really used to be an identity for the Cardinals back in the 70s, the Dan Deerdorf days, and we have not seen since. Feels like that's definitely the new philosophy that Arizona has going forward, is kind of trying to be able to have one of the better offensive lines in the league.
Cool. Well, you mentioned the tight end stuff as a way to kind of accelerate the performance of that offensive line. You mentioned going 3 tight end, 2 tight end, and mixing things up. I'm really curious about, obviously Trey McBride has been having an insanely productive year, has made me some money, so I don't mind that. I don't know that much about Elijah Higgins or Travis Vokolek, but I do know that Tip Ryman, at 270 pounds, had an outstanding NFL combine. I know that his blocking tape at Illinois was fantastic, teammate with Isaiah Adams, and that he was able to tear apart a blocking sled at the combine. I wanted to know if, given that athletic profile, they've been able to unlock anything from him as a receiver, or how he's being used, and just kind of generally speaking, how often it is in non-obvious running situations they deploy extra tight ends.
Yeah, so with Ryman, what's been interesting is that in the non-obvious running situations, they really have used Elijah Higgins a little bit more there, as far as if they're going to be looking at having a pass catcher that goes downfield, is able to kind of chip and release. A lot of what Ryman has been there for has kind of been that sixth offensive lineman. So if you're talking about how the Steelers use Darnell Washington and haven't used him as much in the passing game, Ryman has only had for this year, I believe that he's had a 1 reception on 1 target for 5 yards. It was like the one outlet pass that he was on that Kyler Murray was like running to his side, hit Ryman, and you're like, all right, great. That's awesome. The athletic profile says that he does have a huge amount of upside, but with the way that he is utilized by essentially being a sixth lineman, you're not really needing to release as much downfield. And then he can be that guy in 13 personnel who you can then be able to use a little bit of either pre-snap motion. There was one great play, I think, that we were able to see against the Chicago Bears. I think it was 2 weeks ago, where they had kind of like the 5 down linemen on the front. The Cardinals then moved Ryman in motion, and then they pulled their right guard, Tristan Colon, as well. And Colon got in a 1 huge block, and then as the other linebacker came down, you had Ryman, who was there as like this, 280-pound, 6'6" player, who I should say, 273 if you want to be pedantic about it, was just able to blow up that 250-pound linebacker, and James Conner is able to pick up a huge gain around the corner for the most part. You're like, that's one of those counter plays, and being able to use that size and athleticism that really is part of why Arizona has been able to see a revitalization in terms of not just their run game of their offensive line, but there's times where we're able to see some matchups that they'll be able to put in where they're able to get a number of bodies and guys in space to deal with having 7 or 8 guys in the box and still be able to get running lanes for some of their running backs. And that's something that is really unique to see because, a lot of the NFL, I think, has been moving towards some 12 personnel, but the way that you're able to do it in terms of how Arizona is, the only guy who's truly a pass catching back is Elijah Higgins. And the fact that he's still able to go in and is a willing blocker, his pass blocking grade is the lowest on the team for the most part. So they're more likely going to use him as a kind of offensive threat when it comes to through the air. He still is good enough blocking for the most part where he's not a liability. I think he's like 18th out of 28 on the team. So you're not talking about like, this is the guy when we put him on the field, teams are going to target when it comes to your run blocking and pass blocking. It's really been something where it's allowed Arizona in a lot of different ways to then have a lot of different solutions in terms of being able to not just get more guys in terms of the run game on heads on hats, being able to kind of get space for some of their backs, being able to take some guys out of the play. But it's also allowed with those play action from under center to then, you can pull a Trey McBride, be able to get him into coverage with the safety having to come down, get the ball at least away from him. He's been really good at yards after the catch this last year. It's something where Arizona's kind of taken on a unique philosophy in terms of what their identity is going to be. And that's what really makes it interesting this year because people have been upset and complaining that, why isn't Marvin Harrison Jr. getting more targets? And it kind of feels like in some ways that this Stefanski-like offense that the Cardinals are running under Drew Petzing, receivers at least have been in some cases maybe not an afterthought, but it just feels like that they're not quite fully fleshed out in some ways, and perhaps some of that's youth that's playing out with the top 2 receivers being in their first and second year. Some of that does feel like a lot of the way that they're game is designed is built around that run game. And when you look at through the pass game, they have to almost seemingly be like, oh yeah, we got to target Marvin Harrison Jr. about 6 or 7 times. There was comments last week and they're able to still produce within that offense. But it is interesting that is not necessarily their identity, but it's something that they really kind of build around the tight end and how their run game works with having guys in space. And then it kind of has the receivers and everything else moves around that as their kind of the sides to this Thanksgiving dinner, as it were.
So, topical reference. It's like it's a bit interesting. I mean, Drew Petzing previously with the Vikings as a receivers coach primarily. Did coached at a couple of different positions, but obviously here as an offensive coordinator. And I just find that kind of interesting given how much more focus there's been, at least in the way that I've seen it talked about of Trey McBride. I don't know who's actually outproducing who between him and Marvin Harrison, but it feels like McBride's production is more notable, at least, than Marvin Harrison's. So I kind of want to know what's going on there. I know people have been frustrated with week-to-week performances regarding him. I've stayed away from him when it comes to like DFS and stuff like that, so I'm kind of clean of that. But people have been kind of concerned about the week to week production. Michael Wilson, I mean, obviously he had an outstanding catch, a phenomenal catch just this past week. But it feels like overall over the course of the season, kind of a similar story. Now, is it your contention that it is the offense, the way that it's designed and called, that is producing this, or are we also seeing kind of some inconsistencies from the receivers themselves? And those are the two receivers everyone focuses on. They also have Greg Dortch, they have Zay Jones, they have another rookie and undrafted guy in Xavier Weaver. Zach Pascal, was he the Tennessee guy that was like?
He was with Philly, actually. He was like one guy that came over.
No,
with
I meant in college. In college.
No, I think you're right. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say it's a little bit different school there.
Yeah. So I might have been thinking about someone else, but yeah, Zach Pascal, 6'1", 6'2". But yeah, he was like a brains guy over in Philly.
Yeah, no, the biggest thing, at least that's been really interesting to see this season as far as the receivers when it comes to with Marvin is a lot of it ends up being kind of schematically how teams have been treating receivers. Like you look at how wide receiver production has gone this year overall for most players, and it just has not really lived up to whether it's been due to injuries being one part of it. Harrison was concussed against the Packers, I believe, and he missed I believe it was the rest of that game, but came back that following week. What we've seen in a lot of different cases has been they've kind of tried to be able to design areas to get the ball to, as far as when it is with McBride and to James Conner, has been kind of the main vehicles that they choose to drive over the last couple of weeks. If you're looking at McBride's logs, I believe, at a franchise record as far as with yesterday. He caught 12 catches for, I think, I want to say 125 or so yards. 133 yards, excuse me, and no touchdowns. He has had one touchdown on the season, which is a fumble recovery, and he's had one touchdown, which was on a rushing play. It was a jet sweep. You're like, all right, you're running a jet sweep to the tight end. This is one of those places where you're like, you'd think it'd be big brain time, but hey, it's only big brain time if you get tackled. What's funny is going back to college, like despite how productive he was in his career at college, he had 2,000 plus yards receiving. He only had 11 touchdowns, and in his final year, he had 2 touchdowns. So you're like, okay, this is a unique guy who is a tight end, hasn't had that same connection or had that same type of red zone threat that we're used to seeing. Whereas Marvin Harrison Jr., you take a look at that, and he's got, at least for an opportunity, I think, through the first, he's got, I think, through the first, it's like about 7 touchdowns or so. So he's getting probably about a touchdown, probably about every other week. So he'll probably finish with somewhere around 9 to 10 touchdowns on the season. He's been their main red zone target when it's come to passing the ball, when it's any sort of non-Kyler Murray, non-James Conner rushing that you're able to see. Kind of drawing up those one-on-one plays and having the small ability in space. What they've not done in Arizona that I've maybe felt they could have done a bit more is kind of looking at Marvin as a similar Lambo to what they've had with the likes of Trey McBride and James Conner. It seems like that in some cases they didn't seem like they were getting him involved into later parts of the game, or they were using him to kind of open up and take away some of that safety play on some different routes. Like there was a route against Seattle last week or I should say on Sunday, that he ran where he kind of runs up and has kind of an in-breaking route. The safety over the top kind of pulls in with him along with the corner. You've got a linebacker in coverage, at least looking for everything underneath, who ends up picking up McBride. And Trey McBride is able to kind of run a route up over to the sticks, make a catch, and breaks a tackle, gets 2 or 3 more yards. And you're like, all right, so like they're giving enough respect for Marvin to clear him out. But a lot of fans of fantasy football have especially complained, going, all right, great, this is awesome. I can't believe we have a Trey McBride decoy is what you spent the number 4 overall pick on. And some of it has been with Marv too. Like he's had a couple of drops. There's a fumble he had. There's a time or two at least that he's looked a little bit more like a rookie out there. And then at the same time, when they've chosen to involve him, it's like he'll kind of end up having one of those 10 catch, 133 yard games where you're like, oh yeah, like this guy looks like he's ready made to be a star. It's fascinating as far as with how Arizona through this year has kind of been able to, in the games that they've gotten Marvin involved in, have been the games that they've really been able to put up a lot more of the points. The games where he's not been involved in, they've had games like the Seattle Seahawks game where you like talk about Trey McBride having a huge game. Maybe you look at James Conner in some games getting that 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. But They really at least have not had a complete game this season outside of the game against the New York Jets at home, where it kind of had all three guys were kind of firing on all cylinders. And it's going to be really interesting to see exactly how much of that's the nature of an offense that flows through the tight end and the running backs, and how much of it is like, all right, here's our plan for Marvin. We're going to take this year over year. And it took, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks before you saw him lined up in the slot more than once or twice per game. And we're like, this is one of the areas that, as we know with previous receivers before, whether it's Justin Jefferson, whether it's how DeAndre Hopkins was for them a few years ago, just seems like having a big target outside, whether that's a Kyler Murray size issue or something that is just having to get used to with these young receivers. And I will say Michael Wilson is a much better run blocker. So sometimes even in those 13 personnel games, you're like, oh, wow, it's Michael Wilson out there. I guess they're going to run the ball here, because I don't know why you would put Marvin Harrison Jr. on the sideline to put Michael Wilson in there. So that's one of the cases where you're kind of wondering how much of it is the kind of overthinking some of the situation from a game-to-game perspective, where some games you kind of get it and you're just able to get those targets. And other games you're like, all right, maybe we're just kind of overthinking stuff or trying to have the rookie be a little bit out of it. They really have shown this year that the games that he gets mostly involved in are the best offensive performances that they have. And it's a case where if they have him involved in a game where he gets less than 55 yards against the Vikings, you're probably not going to see a Cardinals victory, because their offense really does need those 3 stars to kind of fire on all cylinders, along with Kyler Murray being able to play a smart game.
Cool. I think it gives us a ton of context about the way that this offense is designed. Really curious about kind of how that'll impact the quarters heavy coverage the Vikings use behind their blitz package. But I think this gives us an opening to talk about the defense a little bit. You wanted to talk a little bit about the cornerbacks. Let's go back to front. Let's start with that secondary. I know that, a lot of the Arizona approach under the previous regime was to get as many versatile players as possible, not as impactful in terms of secondary roster construction. It did result in Budda Baker, which is, I think, one of the most positive elements of that particular approach. But I'm curious about Garrett Wilson, Garrett Williams. Sorry, Garrett Wilson's the Jets receiver. Garrett Williams, who I think we expected more from this year. I mean, he was like a 3rd-round pick, so there's only so much you can expect. But Garrett Williams, Starling Thomas, Budda Baker at safety. I don't know who the other safety is. I think Jalen Thompson's hurt. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Thompson's been hurt. We'll see if he comes back this week or not. They did take Dadrian Taylor Demerson in the 4th round of the NFL draft this year, and he was the other camp star that they had. Now, the guys that stood out the most in camp, at least from what we had seen as far as rookies, were Marvin flashed instantly as far as the athlete, the profile, just being able to make things look easy. Darius Robinson showed at least that he was going to be able to be pretty solid as far as both a pass rusher and with flexibility. He's a guy that you could be able to kind of have outside anchoring as one of your defensive ends, and then he could flex into that defensive tackle, that 3 tech, to be able to rush from the interior as well. That was part of why Arizona was really looking at him even more than the possibility of using a 3rd-round pick to trade up for one of those top edge rushers. They felt comfortable enough with him as a player. He just ended up getting hurt in camp, and his mother passed away earlier this season. We're expecting him to get his first action of the season against the Vikings, but again, it's been a long road. This is something where originally we wondered if he was going to play at all this season with just the way that things had gone around. It's a 23-year-old guy, so part of it at least is you want to offer not just condolences, but at the same time, the NFL, as far as it goes, it just, the show must always go on. So that'll be something that's going to be interesting to see how they deploy him, the number of snaps he gets. Is it hey, we're going to put you in and you're going to be kind of getting starting level snaps, or all right, here's your 5 snaps you're going to get, and then we'll put you in on these 3rd down plays. Go get him, kid. The biggest thing with Arizona this year has been that their defense has really taken the lack of edge production that they've been able to get and a rash of injuries to the defensive line, and they've been able to essentially overcome it through the safety and secondary play that they've had. So as far as the secondary and how that's structured, in 2023, we saw a lot of what would seem like quarters and cover 2 coverage, where you would see Budda Baker. He did not have a very statistically significant season. A lot of the questions we had with the defense was, is that something that is by design? Is it something that this defense is just going to, be trying to get more bodies up front? what I think we saw later last year when Garrett Williams came back, and some of what we've even been able to see this year, is that Nick Rallis is kind of a bit of a psycho. That's been one of the things that we can say with the safety. You're in a spot where you're watching, at least with how Budda Baker, and he'll sort through and shuffle through his safeties and his defensive tackles to the point where you'll have Garrett Williams will be down there in the nickel spot and Budda Baker will be lined up from the deep safety. And then all of a sudden they'll switch to the point where Williams will drop back suddenly into the safety role. And then Baker will then drop back overall into a run support. And then he fires Jalen Thompson off, at least, where these three safety, now they'd be Dadrian Taylor-Demison, obviously, if Thompson misses time. And being able to have solid production, at least from those safeties, has been able to, with the likes of Starling Thomas, be able to actually have really consistent secondary play. The biggest thing with the Cardinals when you're watching them on tape is that they're disciplined. Guys at least are covering down there as far as a secondary. There's very few blown coverages that they actually allow. The issue Arizona has had ultimately is that without having those alpha type of pass rushers, they have to really manufacture pressure with the blitz or being able to get coverage sacks. And that's something that really bit them against the Seahawks, where Geno Smith probably got like an average of 3+ seconds to throw. It felt like it was 7 or 8, but the fact that their coverage at least has been able to be with against those receivers solid enough that teams have kind of had to not just like pick and guess, but it's been very, very, not like to say that the front defensive line is not needed, but almost like you're going, oh, well, when they ever do get a defensive lineman, like they drafted edge rusher, they maybe get another defensive tackle in here. They're starting 2 defensive tackles that they both paid are out for the season. Roy Lopez has been on and off IR. It's really just been 6th round pick. Let's see if I remember this. Dante Stills is out of, yeah, he's, I believe, leading them in sacks this season. So you're like, all right, you got an interior defensive lineman. I think it's Zaven Collins is 5 as well, but like those have mostly been coverage sacks as far as actually like generating pressure, being able to actually have like these defensive sacks that make like a huge kind of beating your man one-on-one. Being tied for the league in sacks as an interior guy who's technically like the backup to the backup is just kind of crazy behavior that Nick Rallis is being able to pull off this defense. Arizona's the 11th in scoring defense this year. And you're like, outside of the safeties, most people would probably not be able to name another player who's on the team for the most part, at least. Maybe someone would be able to be a Kaiser White person who was a Philadelphia Eagles fan who could recognize that name, but they really have seen a lot of a star-making season from Garrett Williams and then having solid safety play from their other 3 starting safeties that really has made the front of their line not have to be able to go all out. They've been consistent as far as with against the run. The biggest player who's making all of that happen is honestly Budda Baker, and then just having a healthy body in their rotation between Naquan Jones and I believe maybe like a Kiris Tonga, and of course the aforementioned Dante Stills. Those guys have really just kind of been on the rotational of an interior that has probably been, I would say, like not underrated, but it feels like what you're watching is something that can't be as real is like the best way to describe it. You're like, all right, you got Roy Lopez is out there. He gets a sack on Josh Allen. You're like, wait, who's Roy Lopez? Why is it happening here? Like, is the coverage downfield like that great? And you watch back on the tape and you're like, yeah, these guys are playing their asses off at least and being coached incredibly well on the defensive side. It's definitely one of those cases of where when you talk about maximizing the talent that you have, Arizona's really been able to do that without having a true kind of star on the defensive line this season.
One member of the secondary we didn't discuss that much that I was kind of curious about, and this might just be the way our lads list them, but Sean Murphy-Bunting was, I thought, a really outstanding player for Tampa Bay. Tennessee didn't get a ton out of him, it sounded like, and so he ends up in Arizona. I'm kind of curious about him. Also, second-round pick Max Melton, I believe the brother of Bo Melton.
That is correct. Mm-hmm.
So what's going on with the cornerback group? Because you mentioned like the defensive structural change a lot, but I kind of want to know specifically about like just how the cornerbacks are playing. I mean, they've got pretty good receiver core they're going up against.
Yeah, so with Murphy-Bunting, he was kind of signed to be like the guy who would be that veteran, that cornerback one who'd take on some of those top guys. And as the season progressed, it just looks like this is probably just either a down year for him or that there was enough, at least as far as athleticism lost, where there's a couple of places, like there's a holding call that he's had. There's been a couple of other times that he kind of would gambled and got bit and burned some in coverage. The defensive coverage actually took a step forward when Max Melton was able to get more starting level snaps on the outside. Having someone, I think, and this is maybe just the philosophy of how Jonathan Gannon coaches defense, being able to look at athleticism and cornerback being one of the top things that they need, as well as physicality. When you bring in a guy who could be like a pure coverage corner, that's something at least that it seems like he can make it work as far as with coverages on the outside, but he really likes to scheme the linebackers into place, move the safeties around. Nick Rallis, especially, who was the linebackers coach in Philadelphia, seems to have kind of a lot of a hand in that. But their defensive backs coach ultimately has gotten guys like a Sterling Thomas, who's an undrafted free agent, a second rounder in Max Melton, who a lot of people were like coming into the season going, all right, like this is the guy that you're trading back from, I think it was a Kool-Aid McKinstry, and then the Eagles at least having a Cooper DeJean. It's like you move back and you get a Max Melton, and then you take a look at some of how it fits on the field. You're like, okay, like his fit in this defense has been really good this season. You can tell at least that he's still a rookie who's kind of having to learn some of the ropes, but being able to hold up at least in coverage against some of the top guys is something that each of the cornerbacks have had to do at one point or the other. The one who's actually done the worst of it so far has, oddly enough, been Murphy Bunting. A lot of Cardinals fans were complaining about some of the different plays. I think it was also more the high leverage situation plays that you're seeing where like he tugs on a jersey or gets called for it or getting burned. That's going to stand out a lot more than, wow, that Sean Murphy Bunting as a corner filled that run defense in a fantastic way. Like he prevented that guy from getting down. You're not going to unfortunately notice that as much as far as a cornerback play goes, especially with Buda Baker in the way that he's been utilized as kind of an agent of chaos who can move all over the field, just to kind of make plays on the ball, to get after the quarterback. It's something where the way that the team has been built, you're at least optimistic that they're able to kind of get by without having to necessarily spend a lot of high draft picks on cornerbacks. Like you may not see the likes of a Patrick Peterson spent, or the team being able to have to go all in on Aeneas Williams like they did years ago. Like it does feel like, at least schematically, they're kind of playing in a way of recognizing that if coverage downfield is disciplined and being able to have enough that they can fire off, which includes some crazy, unique sort of alignment sometime. Last year, I think there was some hullabaloo made when Rallis had two guys who were, I think, lining up at least, and then the rest of the players are back in coverage, one of those being a linebacker. And this season, we had a kind of an almost Hail Mary attempt with the end of the half for the Seahawks, and he had one single down lineman that was there with the other players on the side. You're like, okay, like this guy is basically not just willing to try new things, but there's a purpose behind it, where when those key situations have come up, you're like able to see guys like Melton or Murphy Bunting be in the right place at the right time. And that's something that I think just is a mark of how much the coaching has improved in Arizona overall, not just at least on the defensive approach that we got to see Vance Joseph build over a couple of years, but being able to at least see them play as a cohesive unit is something that's been really, really kind of fun to see, at least from someone who actually isn't just fully invested in the offensive side of the ball, as I know a lot of people in DFS and fantasy and others are.
Well, I did want to talk a little bit, like you mentioned, better coaching, unlocking some of these players. I'm kind of curious about what that means for linebackers, because we all know other teams in the NFC West have kind of, I guess, underinvested in the position. It's been kind of like a thing that we've seen with the Rams, a tiny bit with the Seahawks with the new regime after letting go of Jordan Brooks. But here we've got some cast-offs from other teams, Kaiser White, Mac Wilson, Chris Barnes. That inside linebacker position, is it just less important to the way the defense is designed? Is it, we'll kind of get to this problem later? What is the approach? Or are they just actually playing well? What's going on?
Yeah, Mac Wilson's probably having the best year. They've actually utilized him a bit as an edge rusher on some third down plays, and it's not even like that he's been able to be as productive. Like he's got one sack, only 2 hits, and a few hurries on the year from the inside linebacker spot. Most of those are actually coming from the edge as far as like how they've utilized that. But they seem to be able to have roles for players and are using the scheme to kind of put those guys into areas of good success. So great example in terms of Kaiser White being a guy who they have being able to blitz, being able to kind of play as an on-ball linebacker for the most part, and then not leaving him out as much in coverage. there's plays where you'll see kind of about 6 or 7 guys at the line. Rallis will dial up, and then he will fire like 2 or 3 of those guys sometimes. Sometimes they'll then back out 2 or 3. So you end up with a 4-man pass rush, but that 4th man is coming from an unexpected place, being able to at least kind of find different things for the quarterbacks to have to read and make snap judgment decisions. What they really have kind of been able to have as an identity this year has been being able to have good coverage linebackers from the edge rushing spot who can at least hold up against the run. And that's something that's been kind of unique, because what's really funny with the Cardinals is going into the last couple of years, we're like, all right, cool. You guys have an awesome opportunity. You can get Isaiah Simmons as that guy in coverage. You got Hassan Reddick potentially over here. Chandler Jones, you're going to want rushing the passer. And they just kind of let all those guys kind of go. And Simmons probably wasn't that best fit as an edge rusher with some of the size and other straight line athlete stuff that was there. But this year they've been able to see a 5th round pick in the likes of, I want to say that his name is Owen Peppo. Owen Peppo is the one. Yeah, he's been one of their best coverage linebackers. He was like a physical freak. He was one of the Feldman's freaks, I think, in that list when he was a couple of years ago. Having athleticism at linebacker, but not having to invest heavily at linebacker, and then being able to say, hey, we're not going to have Peppo be that guy who's going to have to, run down and be able to get his nose into it, versus letting that be kind of what Zaven Collins and what they're able to get out of Kaiser White, who was actually now the namesake to Nick Rallis's newborn child, which is kind of interesting. You're like, oh, Kaiser's his middle name. You're like, that's kind of fun when players can take their players' names, but also in the same spot, I'm like, I feel like as a player, I'd be coming into contract extensions like, hey, your coach
you can't cut that
his
guy.
middle son after me. Like, you're going to cut me? Like, you're not going to give me a deal. I'm going to ask for another year for the most part, like that one, because if you cut it, you're gonna be the one to tell that coach, hey, son, we cut your the player that I named you after. Like, he's gone now.
He's going to
the Seahawks now. Like, so it's something where what we were at least able to see was it felt like that the Cardinals in previous years would have to spend higher picks in getting athleticism at linebacker. What we've really seen has been schematic and coaching wise. They've been able to kind of get good play without having any Pro Bowlers or all pros, at least at the linebacker spot, like the San Francisco 49ers, or even in the division, the Seahawks with Bobby Wagner for years. It's a place where at the inside linebacker spot, a lot of where I think that the issues that can come up would be curious for me to watch will be how do they do in coverage with a top tight end like a TJ Hawkinson, because that's something that they did have some struggles against the Chargers with Will Dissly. It's one of those places, at least, where if you can find that right balance of being able to have a tight end on a linebacker or a safety, it is one of those places where you can make some really solid big plays if you're a quarterback, knowing that a reliable target there is fine. Cardinals have been pretty good overall for the most part in terms of coverage, but when it comes to the tight end, that's one of those areas I could see being a potential, if you could draw up a mismatch for one of those possibilities, because say what you want about how good Arizona safeties have been in the past and how they're playing this year, they're still all about 5'9" and shorter. And that's one of the places, at least ultimately, where what we saw last week is that there's a couple of big plays that some tight ends were able to make. We saw the Cardinals able to kind of take away some of the other tight ends in previous games, but it was mostly, I think, due to coaching. Like, Cardinals are taking Cole Kmet out of the game, and this is one of the last games that Shane Waldron's going to coach. I'm probably not going to chalk that up to the safeties and linebackers play so much as I'm probably going to be taking a look at Caleb Williams getting sacked 6 times and escaping from another 6 with his legs. That's probably a little bit more of the reason there. So that's where they're at the linebacker spot. It'll be interesting to see when they do have some of these picks next year, like a top 120 pick. Do they just continue to spend investing in some of those high-end picks just to try to make it better? Or what they did back in Philly was get a guy like a Kaiser White in the 5th round, kind of have him coached up and be able to use that athleticism in the right role. And I think that it's going to be probably more of that for Arizona in the future than, going out and getting that that top-notch top 10 overall draft pick, at least, like we see in a Roquan Smith.
So they traded for Baron Browning at the edge position. They also, I don't know, you mentioned Zaven Collins really quick when we were talking about linebackers. Have they decided on a position for him? Is he an edge rusher, or does he get to do some other stuff now? Because I know that was like a thing.
Yep. No, he is a full-time edge rusher for them. But What's interesting is that he also has been, when it comes to kind of finding his fit and his role in the team. He's their overall best run defender. He's an 87.3 grade on the season when it comes to run defense. Like, he is basically a brick wall. And that was something that we did see in college. The athleticism and how he was utilized as far as being able to drop back in coverage has been really interesting as well, because, we're talking about as a pass rusher, he's one of those players who that's not going to be his bread and butter, because he doesn't have that same flexibility, that same length to be able to get after the passer, but he's not going to be like completely hampering as far as that goes too. And when it comes to coverage, like, that's one of the other things with his instincts and ability. It drops back to be able to be someone in coverage. I think it's like about top 6, actually, I should say, in terms of his coverage grading and in terms of what we see on tape. So it's someone who you can at least say is, hey, he's not going to be that guy who's going to ever get you more than like maybe one single double-digit sack season that'll have as like his best productive season. But when it comes to how his fit is, they essentially figured that he's a guy who's going to be that run stopper that goes there, anchors the edge, is able to not be a liability when rushing the passer. And if you end up in a set with tight ends, he can drop back in coverage. And that was something that we've really seen Arizona be able to make use of this season that they kind of hadn't in years past. In years past, Arizona wanted his coverage at the inside linebacker spot, and he just didn't seem like he had the functionality of having things happening in front of him, having guys making plays behind him, much more of like an on-ball edge rusher, as weird as it might be to like think of that. That's kind of been like the role that they've been able to carve out for him. They got him an extension for the next 3 years up before the season, and he really has kind of blossomed into that type of a spot where you're looking at Arizona and saying, yeah, that's like, if you're going to try to run the ball, he's going to be one of those guys who can stack and shed, be able to get those tackles for loss. And he's one of those guys who, if you're not careful, you could run into him with the coverage sack on the outside. It was one of those strange areas where after years of the Cardinals bringing in different linebackers or edge rushers and moving some guys like Isaiah Simmons around, or even moving a Hassan Reddick around, once Reddick at least got to Philly with Jonathan Gannon, it's like, all right, here's your spot and your role. It's set for you. This is where your strengths are. He had a 16 sack season. You get back over to Zaven Collins, and he's got the best run defense on the team in general. It just kind of shows you that they at least are able to have a better ability of not just diagnosing players as far as with their strengths or covering up for their weaknesses, but being able to actually have a plan for where those players are and being able to grow in some of those roles as well. And it's been fun to see as Zaven Collins has kind of gone from this player who Cardinals fans were like, all right, like, this is the guy that
figure it out.
This is the guy who's got to figure it out. He's just having this bust. He's having this back and forth. And then he gets into a spot. You're all of a sudden like, oh, this is perfect. This is great. And for me, as someone who like watches different draft prospects covers and goes through some of the players, either film ahead of time, it was wild for me to be able to like, yeah, I saw him as more of an inside linebacker, but once you see him shedding blocks, at least that he wasn't as an inside linebacker the year before, you're like, oh yeah. And then Hassan Reddick, tackle for lost king at Temple. They're like, let's put him inside at 230. You're like Zaven Collins at 250. You're like, let's put him outside as an edge. And you're kind of seeing at least a more cohesive identity that the Cardinals are able to take with the guys that they currently have, which is unique because like this is a team that did not draft Zaven Collins. The GM didn't draft him. The coach didn't draft him. It's just kind of an interesting case where one of your better players is not some guy that you were able to bring in or find, but someone who was already on the team that just was not being utilized correctly.
All right, and then you've mentioned the defensive tackles a couple of times, specifically that Dante Stills is leading the team in sacks as a 6th-round defensive tackle. We also have former Minnesota nose tackle Kairos Tonga here. Roy Lopez, who has the most chess-like name of the whole group, and then LJ Collier, who blew up his former team just yesterday. What does this group do for the Cardinals? Is it just pure pass rush? Do they have the capacity to produce some good run stuffing? You mentioned that Zaven Collins is the best run stopper. Is that kind of a unique position for him to take, or do these defensive tackles play a big role?
Yeah, the D tackles do play a big role. They actually had gone out and brought in 2 defensive tackles on the year that they'd wanted to start. They were like, we lost so many guys last year to injury. There was time or two where I think they had 1 week in 2023 They signed Roy Lopez after he had been released, and he started for them that week because they were that many defensive tackles had gotten hurt for them. You go into this year, and they're like, we're going to go and sign guys who haven't missed games in like 2 or 3 years. Bilal Nichols has been super healthy. Justin Jones, maybe not as productive. And those guys ended up lasting 3 games and 6 games. So they played a total of like 9 games between them on the season. And Dante Stills is like the one guy who was there last year. Is like, I guess we got one healthy guy for the most part with him. And then Roy Lopez, who I will say at least, Lopez is kind of the, I'd say it's a love-hate relationship. The hate being ironic only because, like, when you search for Mesquite High School, which is my alma mater at Arizona Cardinals, my name doesn't show up there. Mina Kimes' name doesn't show up there, at least the same way. So I've gotten pushed down to the number 3 spot, is what that means essentially. So thank you to Roy Lopez, at least. Shout out for, taking the only thing that I had going for me on the search engine and making sure that now everyone is, seriously, they at least have been able to, with manufacturing some of the different touches and the blitzes that Rallis has done, he's been able to get some one-on-one matchups against interior linemen for some of these defensive tackles. And so what we've seen a lot of how he's used is that the linebackers, they're having guys like Kaiser White and Buda Baker are being the main guys coming in after the run stopping, of getting after the quarterback, having other linebackers in coverage, and then that's allowing a guy like an LJ Collier or I would say another one, at least, like you said, Stills, Dante Stills, being able to then kind of get some of those one-on-one matchups from some of those 3-tech spots. They've really are not running right now a pure nose tackle. They had been for a little bit when they had Bilal Nichols in there. They kind of have moved Roy Lopez to there, and so while he's pretty decent size, it's still a little bit smaller. So what we saw last year with the Cardinals was they had times just to be able to get different plays to give themselves the best chance. They had times where they had 5 linebackers lining up on the field because that was their best 5 pass rushers. They're going to be damned if they're not going to at least get after the quarterback in some way on this 3rd and long. That flexibility is something that we've been able to see, that they've both been able to scheme guys into position and take advantage, especially against teams that are playing backup offensive linemen. The coverage downfield has played a part of that. It's really one of those cases in where they don't really have a guy who can be like that top-notch penetrator that, fans in the Cardinals are hoping Darius Robinson can be from the 3-tech. But being able to have the defense function better as a sum of the whole than as the individual parts has really meant that they've been able to see a little bit more pass rush from the interior, and that's kind of been with their overall best pass rusher from the edge in a Dennis Gardeck, who earlier this year, a lot of people were like, he had 3 sacks in a game, and then he tears his ACL for the second time.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of the Dennis Gardeck experience, is like, he's going to be one of those candle is going to burn super bright type of things, plays in special teams or forever, and then gets after it with a hustle. And then we've seen, unfortunately, like some guys, when it comes down to the star players and the others, are just not quite going to be able to, have a full and complete season. He did at least get a nice deal beforehand as far as it goes, and he's in a tough spot entering free agency. But yeah, like, this is kind of where it's been, is like you're talking about a team that took him and BJ Ojolari off the field, that's lost most of their best edge rushers, that's lost all of their starting defensive tackles, and yet they're still finding a way to make it work each Sunday, being able to hold teams to under 19 points a game for the last, I think it's almost a month now that they've been able to hold teams under that. It's really just an impressive story that this defense has had, and I think it's going to have Rallis, maybe not necessarily next year, but at some point soon, probably get some head coaching looks when it comes to a team that's looking for someone who can actually bring caliber, at least of defense, like we're seeing, despite not having really like that much to work with. It's in a Swiss Army knife versus the Cutco knives, if you wanted to talk about Arizona's defense. And that kind of applies to those defensive tackles too. Gannon believes in rotating those guys in and out. So you may be a Kairos Tonga sack on one play, and then the next one you're around, you're like, oh, there's Dante Stills getting into the backfield, getting some pressure on the quarterback. It's very unique as far as there's not a lot of teams, at least, that are really doing what Arizona is, and if they are, they're not doing it to the same success rate that Arizona has been, and we'll see how that plays out as they play some tougher teams and as teams start to ramp up a lot more of their run games later in the season with their upcoming schedule, and against a Vikings team with pretty interesting combination of aerial attack and Aaron Jones for how they've been essentially able to kind of thrive despite it technically being a rebuilding year in many.
Right. You mentioned Kairos Tonga, can occasionally just grab a sack as part of that rotation. A lot of Vikings fans, perhaps I fanned the Flames a little bit, We're a little upset that they didn't retain the services of Kairos Tonga after he flashed a little bit in Minnesota. How has he just overall been performing? Just super quick in Arizona.
No, he's been doing at least all right. He's been part of the rotation. Whenever Arizona's going into those typical nose tackle looks where you need to get like someone who's there like at the 0 or at the 1, that's been one of the roles that he's kind of rotated in and out on depending on some of the play down, the situation. Because Arizona rotates so much, he ends up probably only getting about probably about a total of like somewhere between like 10 to 20 snaps. I think the most amount of snaps he got was an injury that happened was against Miami, in which he actually had like one of the higher tackling grades on the team. It's something in which Arizona, as far as it comes to with how the team has been, and this is, maybe speaks to some of the culture areas, that they've kind of pulled together a bunch of odds and ends, but at the end of the day, like they've been able to kind of have some of these close wins they've been able to pull off. And part of it is by having a guy like a Tonga who doesn't have to be able to play a ton, but he can come in, be able to get tackles from that nose spot tackle position, get off the field on 3rd and long, and being able to at least having those roles and playing well in them. That's part of with football of just being a game where like, hey, are you going to block? Are you going to tackle? Are you going to like catch? Like those are a lot of the basics to this game that a lot of times we can get lost in the chess piece. But at the end of the day, it is people having to just kind of go out, do what their job is, and having good coaches that make sure that job isn't going to be, putting someone like Tonga as an edge rusher, like whatever crazy thing you want to talk about there. We'll see if the Cardinals end up keeping him with next season, because they did sign those guys to another longer deals with Justin Jones and Bilal Nichols. Wouldn't shock me if he ends up back on the free agency market if the Vikings wanted to try to bring him back.
God, that injury list is voluminous.
Like 11th ranked defense in scoring, and with the half of their guys, including their top 2 edge rushers, their top starting, like they don't have a single member of their start. I think they've got 2 actually, I take that back. 2 members of their starting front 7 are still there, in Zaven Collins and Kaiser White. Everyone else is either a depth piece as the starter's gone out for the year, and the fact that they're at least playing this well is just tremendous, at least credit to the team, to the staff, and everyone who's there, because we're expecting BJ Ojulari to be their top edge rusher. Right. He's out. They put Dennis Gardeck in these pass rush situations. He goes out. They need some defensive tackles that are going to be able to stay healthy, guys. It's all we need. Just stay healthy. They can't even do that. And Arizona's at 6-5 and is, they're in second to Seattle now, but still tied in first for the division in one of the toughest divisions in the league. It is one of those places that you're going to have to say, like, looking back, we may talk about that. Like, hey, I remember before the Cardinals got that one defensive lineman who was just a star for them for a number of years. Like, yeah, that one year where there was just like Tonga was coming in. We're like, who's going to be the starter for them this week? That's really what it's been for them this year.
Also on that injury list, Matt Prater, Chad Ryland, former New England Patriot, former Maryland Terrapin, in for them. I don't know. I actually don't know anything about Blake Gillikin, their punter, either. How have the specialists been looking? Is it an issue?
Gillikin's actually having a really good season for the most part. Like that one, I have to remember exactly where he is as far as if he's ranked, but he's been able to consistently be able to get like about 55 plus or so on punts, and he hasn't had many that go back into the end zone. As far as like, I'm not someone who's going to necessarily like study punters, at least for the most part, but he's been a plus for them as far as with this average. I believe that he's punt gross is about 49.5, so he's 11th outside the top 10, 13th at pinned inside the 20. He's overall like one of those places where it's not like saying he's a weapon necessarily, like you may have as far as like in Seattle with how they'll have one of those guys with Dixon. But he's done well. Ryland has been the one that's been a bit surprising because he came in and with Prater at least going on to IR and having a decent issue with, we'll see if he ends up kind of coming back or activated or is released, because Ryland came in and had like 3 different games with 3 opportunities to have to make game-winning kicks that were not necessarily like chip shot field goals. And last week was the first time that he actually had missed a field goal or extra point for the Cardinals, was in the fourth quarter with pouring rain. He ended up kind of pushing it a little bit to the left. So it's at a place where with Prater being how old that he actually is, it seems like the Cardinals are probably going to roll forward with the younger kicker who did struggle last year with the Patriots, and just kind of shows sometimes with kickers, like you'll have a guy who ends up performing super well, and then sometimes you'll have a guy who just ends up just having a down year or a down season. it can sometimes be harder to determine in between. Like, talking about like a Daniel Carlson and how his kicking goes with the Vikings and now apart from the Vikings has just been fascinating, because a lot of times you're like, oh, that guy, oh, he was terrible for us, he's having a great season for you, huh? Weird. And that really is how it can go in the NFL. Just the consistency for some guys to be able to have that is hard. But overall, with, I'll probably give Ryland a bit more concern if he ends up missing some kicks indoor in the dome next year. I think with the Seahawks getting after him in the rain last week is probably something that you can give a guy a pass on, considering that he's won games for them with those late game kicks, at least for 3 games earlier in the season.
All right. So I haven't actually looked up the point spread for this game. It's like we're recording this on Monday, so it's probably going to change. But what is your kind of intuition for how this game is going to play out?
Yeah, so it looks like, at least with how this one's been set up, I believe the Vikings are favorites, but it's only by 1.5 points. I think that the biggest thing that we've at least have to see with Arizona is going to be this could be similar to last week in where it's a defensive coordinator matchup. Brian Flores is unique in how he runs his defense with the blitzes, being able to have, especially on second down, from guys in different angles. Whereas there's times that I almost said Jonathan Gannon. Gannon and Rallis will basically look like they're going to be blitzing, and then guys will sometimes back off. They got an interception of Geno Smith like that last week, showing a press man cover 0 that they bailed from. They just were able to have their cornerback kind of take and trail over to a certain zone in the middle of the field. Geno ends up not quite putting enough loft on the ball, and he picks it off. I could see this being a much lower scoring game than probably these offenses are capable of. I've got this as being potentially like a 21-20 or 19 sort of game, because with the way that these teams are, they're kind of both functioning as defensive teams. Although the one thing that, of course, I think is going to be really interesting to watch is how the teams will attack their number one targets. For the Cardinals, you'd normally assume there'd be a Marvin Harrison Jr., but in this game, it's going to be seeing how the Vikings match up with Trey McBride, and then do they get Marvin Harrison Jr. involved should teams start to pay more attention to kind of covering some of the middle of the field. And whereas on the other side, given how Kyler Murray has had struggles against the blitz, looking at how they're going to deal with some of that as far as putting Murray on the move, being able to have him use his legs. One of the things that we've seen with Murray in his early years with Cliff Kingsbury was he would really struggle with the blitz, because you would have times where the play call would be the play call, and his best way of dealing with the blitz was he'd be able to just kind of take off, get out from behind the blitz, get a big play downfield, or kind of be able to run forward and pick up a first down sometimes with his legs, because he'd be so quick that if teams are blitzing from one spot, they get pushed a little bit too upfield, all of a sudden he's got an open lane in front of him. I think that the ability of it being in an indoor game is probably going to matter, but I think that the way that these defenses, at least overall, are playing, and I think with how Arizona, they've been less of a team that's going to be going out there trying to throw it like the Chicago Bears did last week, for the most part, of just trying to kind of, Caleb Williams kind of just had to go through the air in order to keep up with how the Vikings are putting up points, despite the lovely decision to blanket Justin Jefferson and forgetting that, yes, there's 3 other very capable receivers on that team as well. Very fun, at least, to be able to kind of see how that coaching decision played out. I got this as a Vikings win, if only because I think that while it could be close, I think that what we've seen for the most part is that the Cardinals are still ultimately a young team. If you look at their splits at home and away this year, they've been blowing teams out at home, but on the road, they've had a few more struggles. The fact it's a home game for the Vikings, I think, gives them the edge. Arizona is, I think, going to be a little bit more desperate. The Vikings just were able to get a close victory off of a division opponent. Cardinals had I would say like almost embarrassing, at least the way that the radio stations are talking about it today, game against a divisional opponent. That's how it goes sometimes. I'm like, All right, well, they had a chance at least in the fourth quarter in the rain. They're going to play the Seahawks again at home in the next 2 weeks. Like, that's the game you're probably going to have a couple more bullets in the gun for. This is one of those games that I think will matter for Arizona when it comes to playoff positioning. If they end up losing this game, you may end up looking back on this as a Cardinals fan saying you could have probably gotten that 6th or 7th spot. You lost it to an NFC North team because of how you played them head to head. So this is one of those places where Arizona, I think it will be close, but at the end of the day, I think that this Vikings team overall, as far as the coaching is concerned, I think that it's going to be equivalent, if not a bit better, on Minnesota's side, not just with the experience, but we've seen some awesome stuff, at least from Kevin O'Connell with Darnold this season. I think the biggest overall change will be Kyler Murray has very rarely had turnovers this season. Like, he actually had his first, I think, interception in several weeks. I think it's been almost a month against the Seahawks by just overthrowing an open guy on a bootleg that he had carrying the ball on fourth down. We've seen Sam Darnold have a little bit more as far as with either things getting in danger, whether it's through teams blitzing a bit more or just like having another pass or two. I think there was one tipped at the line that was against Chicago last week. To me, if the Vikings can keep it clean and not have those turnovers or limit it to just one, that would be, I think, a good recipe to success. Where it really would end up kind of shifting toward Arizona is if it ends up being a negative turnover ratio for the Vikings. Arizona is able to maybe get the ball in some short field position. That's where I think if Arizona is going to be able to have a chance to be able to, get a win on the road against a future playoff team, that would be the spot that I think that they'd have to try to be able to get it. And that's going to be really curious to see how it plays out. This is probably one of those games that I would have loved to have seen flexed into, like the Sunday night or the Monday football spot.
Yeah, that would have been fun.
It would have been fun, but apparently, Disney Plus is having a cool thing with The Simpsons that they've already animated for. The voice actors have already come in for, so that's the reason why it apparently was not flexed. And I was like, it's great. Nice to know, at least that's still the capital behind Disney is keeping our games bad. Now I think it's still, is it Browns and Bengals or something like that? Like, you got two playoff teams and then two non-playoff teams. You're like, all right, well, hopefully the only homer, at least, it's going to be happy in that spot. Then will be the one that's named Simpson, because I'm not looking forward to having that game on the national TV compared to this.
Just a quick clarity. So it looked like at the season it opened as Vikings 1.5 point favorites. Right now, nearly every book has the Vikings as 3.5 point favorites. If you're an arbitrage guy, head over to DraftKings, I guess, because they have the Vikings at -4. So that's the difference. So it's basically how you broke it down, is that kind of a small difference there, edged out by home field advantage plus a little bit more. All right, man. Thanks for coming on. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can go ahead and follow at least at x.com, twitter.com, what you want to call for each of those. But the Redbird Reboot podcast is the best thing you can at least follow if you're a Vikings fan. I know that it seems like we haven't gotten together as often, but these games end up being usually so crazy. I remember a few years ago, we were like, all right, this game is definitely over. Vikings are about to kick an extra point. And then, of course, the one single point came back to bite. It's just been some craziness that's popped up when these two teams get together. You can follow at least over there at Blake Murphy 7 as well. If you're looking just to kind of dialogue, or, if you're looking for some betting props, this is one of those weeks at least where after things went on offense the last couple of days, we're probably going to be a little bit more bullish on some of the other guys in Arizona getting some opportunities. And of course, smashing Trey McBride with the over has probably made you money, like you said, this season, and will make it money. Smash the over and under on touchdowns for McBride. It seems to be the case this year.
All right, man. Thanks so much.
Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif of... and he can be found on Twitter at ArifHassanNFL. I'm your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or at my personal account at BigMono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merch. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
Hey, all things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.